Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming today to Columbia Climate Conversations Environmental Justice Summit. My name is Lauren, and I'm a senior in sustainable development and the creator of this initiative. And I've been supported by the most wonderful team that anyone could ever ask for. Benjamin Keisling, Kailani Acosta, Kwolanne Felix. Thank you to the three of you for just coming along on this journey with me, and I'm just grateful for the community that we've built here and how far this initiative has come. So thank you all for coming today. I want to begin today by amplifying the work and words of the Native American Council at Columbia University. The Lenape people lived here before and during the colonization of the Americas. We recognize these Indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. This acknowledgement stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward. Columbia Climate Conversations began as a vision. As a young Black woman here at sustainable development in the environmental space, it's really been evident for me for a long time that the environmental and sustainability spaces have been majority white. And I wondered what it would be like to hold a space and to create a platform for diverse perspectives on environmental issues. And in the fall of 2020, through an internship with the Earth Institute, I was able to start working with Kailani and Ben and to bring that vision to life. So we started Columbia Climate Conversations with the mission to center diverse perspectives in conversations where they've historically been marginalized by bringing anti-racism and intersectionality to the forefront of conversations about climate change. And since then, we've had 12 virtual panels focused around climate and social justice on topics from food to fashion and disability justice and Indigenous futures. And all of them are recorded and on our website if you want to go and watch them. Shameless plug, had to put that in. But it would be really great to acknowledge also just the work that we've done. And in 2021, we've had the privilege of having Kwolanne Felix also join our team. And Kwolanne has just contributed so much to the team, coming up with panel ideas, elevating our web presence, and she's definitely stepped up our poster game with her graphic design skills. So we're very grateful to her. And we've also raised over $20,000 to provide compensation for all of our panelists. And we've had the chance to feature an amazing range of perspectives, the majority of which have been women of color. So without further ado, today we are thrilled to gather the Columbia community here today to both celebrate what we've already accomplished and to look forward together. We'll begin this summit today with a keynote from Leah Thomas, author and founder of Intersectional Environmentalist. And following that, we will have three fantastic panelists who work in different aspects of environmental justice here in New York City. And finally, today's event will end with an informal mixer and the opportunity to do something creative together as we reflect on all that we've learned. So without further ado, I would like to thank the Columbia Climate School and Center for Science and Society for sponsoring today's event. And just thank you all for joining us. And I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Leah Thomas. So join me in a round of applause.
Hi everyone, I so wish that I could be there with you all today, but I want to say thank you all so much for coming and taking some time out of your day to learn about climate justice. I'm currently dialing in from Southern California, but I'll be in New York in a couple of days, so hopefully I get to meet with some of you all. But to get started, I want to talk to you all a little bit about intersectional environmentalism. And from a show of hands in the audience, since my camera is so nicely positioned towards you all, has anyone heard of the concept of intersectional environmentalism? We'll get some hands, some nods. Okay, cool, cool. Well, I'll share a little bit about what it means to me. And to start off, I'm going to read a couple of pages from the introduction of my book. If you have it with you, you can follow along on page 3, but this is essentially the thesis for this book, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about my work and why climate justice and intersectional approaches to environmentalism are so important to me. So to kick it off, I believe that we can't save the planet without uplifting the voices of its people, especially those most often unheard. And we should care about the protection of people as much as we care about the protection of our planet, because to me, these fights are the same. As a society, we often forget that humans are a part of our global ecosystem and that we don't exist separately from nature. We coexist with it each and every day. And unfortunately, as with other animals, some humans are endangered and facing a multitude of social and environmental injustices that impact their ability to not only survive, but to thrive in liberation and joy. Why then are conservation efforts not extended to the protection of endangered humans and their human rights? This is a question I've struggled with as a Black environmentalist for years, because in my environmental practice, caring for the earth means caring for its people. So I wrote this book in large part because of my experiences as a Black woman trying to navigate the environmental space and a lot of learning lessons I found along the way. So to take it all the way back to my environmental journey, it started during the summer of 2014. So I had started my college career in Southern California studying biology, but it just didn't, there was something about it. I didn't really like it. So I went home for my summer break back to St. Louis, Missouri, and I decided to change my major to environmental science and policy, in part because I knew that I really loved the earth, and also partially because my parents are really traditional and they told me that I had to be a doctor. So I decided to show them that environmental science was also a BS program, so maybe I could be a scientist. And it just seemed like a really fun science and a compromise. So I had about 2 weeks while I was in St. Louis and Florissant, Missouri, before I was about to go start my new major as an environmental science student. And with those 2 weeks, I was just relaxing and ready to go back to school. And unfortunately, I got a call from a friend of mine asking me if I knew a gentleman named Michael Brown. And at the time, I didn't know Mike, but his name has forever been on my mind since that moment in August. And I found out shortly after what had happened with the police officer involved shooting of Michael Brown, about 10 minutes away from my house. And my life completely changed as I saw my city erupt in protests and uprisings. My parents and my family, we went to as many vigils as possible, and we were really just trying to understand what had happened to Michael. And after 2 weeks, I had to go back to school to fly to California to start my major as an environmental science and policy student. And in many ways, I had a sense of survivor's remorse, and I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. So as I was doing my introductory classes, learning about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all of these pieces of legislation that are supposed to protect people equally in terms of environmental hazards, I felt a deep sense of sadness because I kept wondering, how could I focus on the Clean Air Act when people that look like me don't even have the right to breathe in every sense of that word? And I started to think about how maybe the events of Ferguson may not have happened. And again, this was a trauma response to the situation. But for me, I felt I was finding so much healing in nature and being able to go outside and explore in Southern California. And I started to think about my community of Ferguson and Florissant and how we didn't have nearly as many parks in our neighborhood. And I started looking into other data about the air quality in Ferguson and wondering, well, maybe if there was better air quality and people could breathe clean air, maybe if there was more access to a safe and healthy living environment, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. And I understand that issues are more complex than that, but I saw social injustice as such a big problem, and I wanted to see if there was a way that I could help within the context of environmentalism. So I started to dig in the data, just really understanding that I want everyone to have a right to breathe in every sense of that word. And in addition to the criminal justice system that needs to be reformed, I also started to find information and data about air quality in communities like Ferguson. And I started to find really shocking statistics as a Black environmental science student, as the only Black environmental science student in my program, that African Americans in this country, about 71% of us, are living in counties that are frequently violating the Clean Air Act and federal air quality standards. That African Americans in this country are living with the pollution burden, so they're experiencing 2.5 times amount the pollution than they even cause in the first place. And this is similar for a lot of other communities of color. So the more that I dove into the concept of environmental justice, the more I found that it wasn't just air quality, it wasn't just water quality, it was also the lack of having green spaces. It was also the placement of toxic waste sites and landfills, et cetera, et cetera. And it was so startling to me because the data was there, it's easily accessible on different government agencies. However, it wasn't mandatory for me to learn about any of this in my environmental science and policy program. It was something that I did as an elective, but I found that to be, again, so startling because there are people who don't have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, which are basic human needs, in my opinion, basic human rights. And this is severely impacting their ability to, again, not only survive, but also thrive in liberation and joy. So I decided to focus on that intersection of social injustice and environmentalism, and to try really hard to raise awareness about the concept of environmental justice. So throughout my studies, this was my area of focus, specifically looking at identity and environmental outcomes. So I looked at things like gender, sexuality, race, so many different, factors, and I really enjoyed doing that work. But over time, whether I was in an academic setting or when I was a national park ranger, when I worked at leading green companies like Patagonia, et cetera, again, I was one of few Black women in those spaces. And when I would try to raise awareness about this inequity that I was finding, I would run into similar types of sentiment that race and racism exists all the way over here, and environmentalism exists over here, and that adding race to environmental advocacy would somehow complicate it. And when I was younger and a lot more meek, I think that that's something that I just brushed aside because maybe I wasn't confident enough in myself. So I kept silencing it, even though I knew that there was nothing more urgent to me than the right for my people and other marginalized people to be able to breathe. But again, I was hearing this in so many environmental spaces that environmental justice is kind of a siloed topic within environmentalism that I just brushed it aside for a very, very long time. But during the summer of 2020, about 5 or so years after the Ferguson uprisings impacted my community, and after I had completely dedicated my life to environmentalism and trying to push, that part of my identity to the back, I couldn't take it anymore during the quote unquote racial awakening of 2020, after more police officer involved shootings and other unjustifiable acts of violence towards people of color. And not only that, when we're talking about police brutality, when we're talking about things like Flint, Michigan, and communities not having the right to drink clean water. The last protest that I had gone to before the summer of 2020 was an environmental protest for endangered salmon. And I remember taking it to the streets for the salmon. And shortly after, just a couple months later, the same environmental protesters that I stood beside to advocate for the smallest of organisms in our ecosystems were not standing up for Black and Brown lives at this time. So I decided that I could no longer take part in a type of environmentalism that did not include the advocacy of marginalized people, the people who are experiencing the brunt of environmental hazards, and the people who will experience the brunt of the climate crisis. Because to me, that doesn't stand for justice at all and is in fact very violent because it's leading to environmental racism that's impacting people's their livelihoods. And I couldn't take it anymore, so I started talking about what I call intersectional environmentalism, which is a concept that has been around for so long in climate justice movements and environmental justice movements. But I wanted to create my own safe space within environmentalism where I could show up as my full self and that anyone could show up as their full selves, because I don't think you need to separate your identity from the work that you do, because in so many ways, my Black womanhood is why I care so deeply about the planet, because of the cultural traditions that have been passed down from my mom, from my grandmother, from my great-grandmother, from their repairing to the ways that they mend things, from the ways that they garden. And I want to be able to proudly show up in environmental spaces as my full self, as should each and every one of you. So what is intersectional environmentalism? To take it back a few steps, I think it's really important to understand what the concept of intersectional theory is. Because intersectionality, it isn't just a replacement word for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think one of the best ways to understand what intersectionality is a court case that Kimberly Crenshaw was analyzing. So Kimberly Crenshaw created intersectional theory, and it was a case with General Motors, or GM, where unfortunately there was a department in GM that fired specifically all of the Black women. They, a classic, very blatant discrimination. They fired all the Black women, and they decided to bring that case to court, and it was dismissed. And the reasoning behind it being dismissed was the judge said, well, there's still Black men that are working at GM. So this isn't a civil rights or racial justice violation. And there's still white women that are working at GM. So this isn't gender-based discrimination. So, let's do away with it. And Kimberly and so many people who have discussed intersectional theory when referring to that court case, they were saying that this outcome of the Black women being fired is because of those compounding factors of them being Black and also being women at the same time. And by ignoring how those two things are compounding and overlapping, then there's these loopholes within the legal system that are allowing Black women and so many other women and other people with overlapping identities to be overlooked. So that's kind of the basis of intersectional theory. It starts kind of in the legal sense and analyzing court cases where there are compounding factors, specifically with Black women and how it was negatively impacting them. And intersectional theory was later applied to feminism, again, because that's kind of its origins and understanding how different aspects might impact someone's womanhood and how not considering that can be really, really harmful. So I remember learning about intersectional feminism, and I wanted to have an intersectional type of environmentalism that also looked at those overlapping factors, whether we're talking about race, income, gender, sexuality, etc. So many compounding factors that might impact someone's ability to develop a really beautiful relationship with Mama Earth, or how those compounding factors contributed to who was experiencing environmental injustice the most. Because I kept seeing how median income and race and gender and all of these things were unfortunately leading to those pollution burdens, like I said earlier, where communities of color and lower income communities were just being bombarded with environmental hazards. And I don't think that it is okay to not consider race in the context of environmentalism when it is the #1 indicator of where toxic waste sites and landfills are placed, and when it's the #1 and #2 indicator of who will experience environmental injustice, not just in the United States, but around the world. So types of environmentalism that don't consider this, they're not doing it for me. And they haven't been doing it for so many people of color for decades and decades. And that's impacting our ability to, like I said earlier, not only survive, but also thrive in liberation and joy. Because our focus as people of color on this earth shouldn't just be on survival. We should also have the ability to experience joy. And I want to say for a lot of climate justice advocates, environmental justice advocates, environmental liberation advocates, there's so many different things, different expressions of this. It isn't rooted in just the trauma. So that's one thing I'd like for you all to take away. It's not just rooted in the trauma of what is happening to us and how our communities are experiencing injustice time and time again. My work as an intersectional environmentalist is more so rooted in joy, the joy of including our stories within environmental education, because I believe that young Black girls like myself, young Indigenous girls, young queer girls, whoever it is, they should see themselves equally reflected in environmental storytelling and history, and have our cultures, our joyful stories infused within that. And it's also about the joy of reclaiming our relationships, our ancestral relationships to the earth. So intersectional environmentalism and climate justice is also rooted in the possibilities of imagining a better future where we have that clean air to breathe and we're able to experience joy. And we're able to know that we also have a cultural and historic relationship with the land. So I decided to write this book that you all have because of all of these things. And what I've been rambling off about is essentially the introduction of this book, where I talk about how the events of Ferguson and how that impacted my hometown and the Black Lives Matter movement really propelled me to action to demand that environmentalists do better by people of color and marginalized communities around the world, because it is our responsibility as we care for this earth to also care for its people, which sounds at times like the most obvious thing in the world. And I know some of you might say, well, I do care for the people. I'm fighting for the planet. I want to stop the climate crisis because I want to protect people in the future. And we can talk about focusing on people in the future and also talk about focusing on who is being impacted right now in the present. Because in the future, yes, it's probably going to also impact wealthy white folks or people who aren't experiencing climate injustice in the same way. But right now, environmental injustice is impacting so many people and it's threatening their livelihoods. And it's something that we need to focus on right now. And I would argue that not focusing on it is perpetuating and continuing environmental racism. So there's nothing more urgent to me in my environmental practice than, like I said, ensuring that everyone has their basic environmental human rights met, having the ability to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and exist in an environment that is safe and healthy for them. And I think intersectional approaches to environmentalism that consider that nuance and consider who's being impacted the most and elevates their voices is a way that we can get to a future that we want to see, one that's greener and regenerative for all people and not just a select few. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was phenomenal. Thank you so much for being here and sharing in this space and for everything that you shared. We're going to open it up for Q&A right now. If anyone has any questions, I see there are some at the video was blurry. Well, now we know that. Did anyone have any questions? And yeah, we can just have a Q&A. Come on. Don't be shy. Hello. There's no mic, so you can, oh, you do have one. Oh, that's fancy. Okay.
So much for talking to us today. My question related to your work with communities. Could you talk a bit more about that for people who don't follow you on social media and don't know all the work that you do practically in the communities beyond your academic work?
Absolutely. So I think one thing that I'm really passionate about is tree equity and also air quality. And I know there's also so many other topics to focus on within the context of environmental justice, but again, especially because of the Black Lives Matter movement and just I want people to have the ability to breathe in every sense of that word and meaning. So something I've been doing lately, I went to, sorry, there's like a car passing by. So I was in South LA the other day planting trees with the community because trees are so great for so many different reasons, but they can be a solution to poor air quality in a lot of neighborhoods. And a lot of tree planting initiatives and programs are not planting the trees where, in my opinion, I think they need to be. So even for a lot of companies that are saying, okay, when we sell, a pair of shoes, we're going to plant a tree. I've started asking the questions like, where are those trees being planted? Are they being planted in Detroit? Are they being planted in South LA where they need to be, where the air quality needs to improve, etc.? And I've been working with an organization called American Forest that I would recommend you all check out, because they have these amazing maps and visualizations of tree cover and how it varies and differs significantly because of median income and race. So you can side by side see different communities based on median income and the racial demographics and see the lack of tree cover in these neighborhoods. And trees are really important, one, because they provide shade. And unfortunately, heat-related illnesses are also increasing in urban environments and Black and Brown communities. Trees are also beautiful, you know, there's that. And thirdly, trees are also really important because they sequester carbon and help improve air quality. So that's some of the work that I'm doing right now. In addition to that, my organization, Intersectional Environmentalist, is now a nonprofit. And we just released a podcast called The Joy Report with a really incredible environmental justice advocate named Ariel King. And it's all about bringing positive climate stories about people of color and about historically under-amplified communities within the environmental space, because we really are trying to reshape different climate narratives and climate storytelling. In addition to that, we have a new series that we're actually rolling out in New York. So I'll be there next week. It's called Earth Sessions, where we partner with local environmental justice organizations. We're partnering with 2 based in Brooklyn that focus on food justice. And we also partner with musicians and kind of trick their audiences to show up for a concert and then learn about climate justice at the same time. So we're really just experimenting with different ways to raise awareness about environmental justice and connect people with the organizations that are in their local communities.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have about 10 or so minutes for Q&A. So if anyone, or Kwolanne, will pass the mic. Thank you.
Hi, Leah. Thank you so much for joining us today. You're such an inspiration, so thank you. You mentioned a lot, and you just referenced it in your last sentence, like joy is kind of like the root in a lot of the work that you're doing. What's something that's giving you hope in the climate movement, both intersectionally and just like the Biden administration, though it's lackluster, like what's giving you hope and kind of keeping you going forward every day?
Oh, what's giving me hope? I would say that very quickly in the last couple of years, a lot of academic institutions are updating their curriculums. So whether we're talking about public schools, I gave a talk at a middle school the other day, which was super fun. They're kind of reshaping environmental curriculums, which I feel like is kind of a long game for policy changes, because with awareness as early as possible about who's experiencing environmental injustice, et cetera, or even the beautiful things like infusing environmental history with the amazing and joyful stories of people of color, et cetera, I think we'll start to see kind of a new generation of environmentalists who automatically think intersectionally and propose solutions that are trying to protect people and the planet at the same time. So that gives me a lot of hope. And one example was my school that I'm actually at right now, Chapman University. It wasn't mandatory to teach an environmental justice class or for students who graduate from that program to take an environmental justice class. And that's true of most universities around the country. I'm currently doing an audit, if anyone has the Columbia curriculum, but I'm doing an audit of universities around the country to see if their environmental programs have a mandatory requirement to take an environmental justice class and not just like read a section on environmental justice. But at Chapman, there was a group of students who were really inspired by IE's work that decided to protest and demand that environmental justice be added to the environmental science program. And they did that during the summer of 2020. And by the spring of 2021, there is the first environmental justice class that's being taught by a woman who's indigenous to the area that is now called Orange County, where the school is. And I just thought that that was so cool to see the people power and momentum of students just taking their education into their own hands. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm trying to think of other things, but I don't know, this event is so cool. It gives me a lot of hope in events like these, people taking time out of their day to talk about climate justice. So I feel very, very hopeful for the future.
Hi. Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm also from Southern California, from a Chicano family, so a lot of your story really resonates with me. I am studying energy policy right now, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are on how to best center marginalized communities in the energy transition. So particularly looking at like when we're moving towards renewable energies, how to make sure that those don't just go to like rich white folks in like Malibu or yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and also sorry if my video is really blurry. I saw that in some of the comments. But in the last chapter of my book, I talk about renewable energy and the green energy transition and the impacts on Indigenous communities. Something that really worries me is I've been at 2 speaking engagements and I've had representatives of like Shell and BP come and start to ask questions. And it seems like, we're on to them. What's going to happen in the near future is that these oil companies know that they're on their way out. I think they are going to pump the last drop of oil that they can, but they're already starting to monopolize the green energy industry. So the same people who and the same industries that have caused a tremendous amount of harm to the earth and have a lot of wealth are going to move into kind of the renewable energy space, which doesn't feel just to me at all. And I keep running into these conversations of questions from them or other people of, okay, well, how can we make this more equitable? And I think the answer is simply climate reparations is one of the only ways to make a green or renewable energy switch more equitable, I suppose, because there are people, there are Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities all over the world who have suffered violence and harm and our entire earth from, our energy systems right now. So I don't know exactly what climate reparations will look like, but it looks a whole lot like Indigenous communities all around the world benefiting financially from this green energy transition and having a seat at the table when it comes to leadership. So that's where I would start. And I'm curious to learn even more, but I am a bit concerned with, oil and gas companies and their rebrands right now.
We have time for about 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience, maybe some challenges and lessons learned of being on the forefront of such an amazing movement and having so much change and so many people looking up to you and listening to your words.
I guess a couple of things that have been a little difficult is a lot of semantics, I would say, because a lot of people started to gravitate towards the terminology intersectional environmentalism, but at the root of intersectional environmentalism is advocating for environmental justice and environmental liberation. So I didn't want people to learn about intersectional environmentalism without understanding the history of the environmental justice movement and the incredible elders who have been a part of that movement for a really long time. So that was something that was largely out of my control, but something that I really, really struggled with because I want everyone to have their flowers, especially people who have been in this movement for such a long time. And that's something that I've struggled with at times because I can be really, honestly, kind of a shy, anxious person. So suddenly being a spokesperson for something seemingly overnight, it felt really, really scary. But I think it was just one of those moments of when again in history are hundreds of thousands of people all around the world going to turn to me and just a group of my friends who are trying to start an educational collective and platform and say, we want to learn about environmental justice and we want to learn about it now. So I think we just kind of tried to keep our heads up and direct people to the resources that are already there and just show people the abundance of organizations and people that are doing this work. I think another thing that's really important is also having a separation of me as an individual, and this is for any organizer, educator, etc., and the work that we do. So I have a nonprofit, Intersectional Environmentalist, that is strictly for the purpose of education. But me as an individual, I might have my own personal platforms, and I don't just exist. And people of color generally don't just exist for the education of other people. We also exist to be joyful and to be ourselves and to be our full selves. So I think that's something that I have struggled with in this movement. I want to be a role model, but I also want to show people that it's okay to have some, professional boundaries at the same time. But it's been good so far, I would say, for the most part.
One last question.
I guess I can ask a question. Something you talked a lot about is like in the beginning of your work, you saw a lot of environmentalists who are majority white, not necessarily taking forward the initiative to be intersectional. But I guess I'd like to ask the reverse. We know so many communities of color who are fighting for just their lives and survival. And not only communities of color, looking at queer communities as well. And they're just like, well, the environmental movement is just something else on my plate. It's just another thing I have to care about in like, kind of like a sea of other issues. How do you encourage other people who are already fighting the good fight of intersectional issues to look at the environment as an integral part of their work?
This is such a good and a really complex question that I think about often, because when I was all the way in sunny California doing research about air quality in Ferguson, and I was finding, oh my God, this community, my community that has already sustained so much trauma. And then I'm supposed to go in and say, oh, and by the way, the air quality is terrible. And we might not be able to fix it in the near future, but we can try, we can plant trees and maybe it's going to get better, etc. So I think about that, especially placing the blame on the systems that are at play rather than the individuals who are just coexisting and trying to survive. And I think there's also a lot of narratives at times within the environmental space where people are like, well, how can we make more, working class people care about this and get behind it? And sometimes I kind of want to just say that they already do in their own way. They're already being sustainable. For example, my family was very sustainable because we're very low income and we had no other way of living. We did not largely cause the climate crisis, and most working class people and people of color are not actively causing this climate crisis. Industries are. So I think in some ways it's not even giving people a pass, but I just want people to survive. And I would rather in so many ways just like show them what they're already doing and saying reward them for that behavior of, it's so cool that you have these cultural traditions to mend clothing, or even I remember thrifting was so shameful when I was younger. I wouldn't tell anybody, but also telling people like, yeah, you're doing a good thing for the planet, even if you're doing it out of necessity, and not just burdening communities that are trying to survive with, the trauma of what's going on, etc. And I think another way is also supporting grassroots organizations within these communities that are specifically addressing this work, because oftentimes they just need more resources and funding. Because there will be people within those communities that are probably trying to make some noise about environmental justice and how it's impacting their community, but they oftentimes don't have enough resources and support. I talk about this in the book, but less than 5% of total philanthropic funding in the environmental space goes specifically to climate justice-based work, and less than 1% goes to Black-led initiatives like that. So I think those organizations need funding, and we also should shift focus to the corporations and industries that could easily make changes that would better the livelihoods of so many people that are just trying to survive. But that was a really good question that I think about often.
Thank you. That was a great question, Kwolanne, and I think a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Leah, for being here. Everyone give Leah a round of applause.
Thank you.